Again, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Alice, for helping to set this up. What we're going to do today is a webinar just introducing the concept of application development and some of the tools that the core team at University of Oslo and DHIS2 have been developing to facilitate the customization of DHIS2 with different web applications. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'll talk a little bit about how you can be involved as well as we go forward. Let's see if we can get this here. Yeah. So I'll talk for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes about all of these topics, about introducing web application development and DHIS2 application platform and those types of things for about 45 minutes. And then I'll have a section where I'll answer any questions that have come up during that time. It's going to be a fairly dense section of content for the first section. So feel free to write down your questions. You can post them on the community of practice. There's a link in the chat on this Zoom call that Alice posted to the section that you can post those, or the topic where you can post those questions, and then I will address those at the end. I also have a couple of my colleagues on the line to check out that section and answer any questions or bring them up towards the end of the presentation. You can use the chat as well if that's a little bit easier than the community, but would prefer that you post them on the community of practice just so we can keep a log of all the questions and post the answers there as well so people can find them later. Again, this meeting is being recorded, so we'll have a link go up later to view it or to share with your colleagues or those types of things. Pretty excited that we had quite a few people signed up for this webinar. We had 130 registrants from more than 45 countries, which is pretty exciting. It looks like we're a little bit less than that now, but hopefully the others will get the recording and watch it later. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started and talk to you a little bit about DHIS2 web application development. Again, please feel free to post any questions you have along the way. So the first thing I want to share is the revamped developers.dhis2.org that we have up for you, which basically is a gateway to all of the development resources. And a lot of those are still in progress or coming along, but this is going to be the place where you should go to find out what's coming soon, what events are coming up, webinars like this one, as well as documentation, getting started guides, and a link to the community of practice where we have a section dedicated just for application development. I'll go ahead and demo that a little bit later, but just wanted to start with this link as well. So you can find a link to the registration for this webinar, for instance, on that developers.dhis2.org. To get started here, what is a DHIS2 application, DHIS2 app? The way we think of DHIS2 is a set of concentric circles. My colleague Scott Russ-Patrick, the analytics product manager, put this together for some of his research. But you can see the different layers of software that go into making DHIS2 work. At the very center of this circle, you have the DHIS2 core, which has APIs, it has the data model, it has all of the different resources that go into how you define indicators, define data elements, define org units, define users, all of these things, the very core functionality of DHIS2 as a data store. Beyond that, we have a set of bundled applications that are developed by the team at University of Oslo, the DHIS2 core team. We have about 34 of those, I believe. Depends on how you count those applications specifically, but there are a number of web applications that you can find in the DHIS2 instance when you first install it. But then there are additional applications as well, and that's where we're talking about the boundary between those two here today and how we can consolidate the way that we build applications at the DHIS2 core team, as well as how other people, like many of people on this call today, build their DHIS2 applications and extend the functionality of DHIS2. And then finally, at the outside, which we won't be talking about today, is interoperable software. So that's server-side integrations that do data processing or integrate with third-party systems or talk to other or export data or import data, those types of things. we'll get into that, how we're going to address that as a feature of DHIS2 in a kind of first-class extension system down the line, but that's not something that we have first-class support for today. You can use the DHIS2 API to build custom integrations. But for today, we're going to be talking just about the middle two rings. So the bundled applications and the periphery apps, the third-party applications that can be installed in DHIS2, and how we can, and how the DHIS2 core team is building tools to facilitate those workflows. So this is a DHIS2 application. Many of you may be familiar with this, maybe many of you may not. This is the data visualizer application. And you'll see that there's a lot of components, a lot of things going on this, but it's just one piece of DHIS2 as a whole. So this is used to visualize certain types of data in DHIS2 and to save those visualizations, share them with other people, embed them into the dashboard, those types of things. This is an example of one DHIS2 application. And there's a lot of components that go into it. I'll get into what those components are in just a minute. This is so if you click on that button in the top right of that last screenshot, the button with the 9 little squares, that will open up the application drawer and show you all of the applications that are installed into your DHIS2 instance. Data Visualizer is one of those, but there are many others, many of which are created by the DHIS2 core team. For instance, Maps application, Pivot Table application, which is deprecated now, and many of these others. But that's also where you'll see any third-party applications that you've installed into your DHIS2 system. So this is a concept of where your applications show up. And you can also turn on and off access to these applications for different users. So there might be things that are very specific to one use case for one particular user in DHIS2, where there are others like the dashboard, for instance, that might be more applicable to all of the users of your system. So what's inside one of those applications? There's a lot of things going on here. So if we looked back at that screenshot that I had before, this one here, one of the first things that you'll notice that this application has, and most applications have, pretty much all of them do, is the header bar up here at the top. So it shows the logo of your DHIS2 instance. In this case, it's the DHIS2 logo. It shows the name of your instance itself. So this might be the instance for the Department of Health for Tanzania, for instance, or it might be in this case, it's an example, a sample instance that we put up that has anonymized Sierra Leone data. And then it has the name of the application, which is Data Visualizer. It has some links to the other parts of the system that you might want to access directly from this. So that's one component of this DHIS2 application. There's a lot of other things going on here too, though. So if we go back to this list of components of a DHIS2 app, you have the header bar, which I talked about up in the top left. You have the application navigation, which we talked about. You also have to do a lot of things in every single application. You have to handle errors. You have to have maybe a file menu to save, load, and share the visualization that you're talking about. You have to have dialogues to be able to display information to the user as they're navigating through your application. You also have to be able to route between different systems so that you can share links within your application to other people. You have to show alerts. You have to translate the entire front end of your application to other locales. That if a user is speaking Swahili or French, you need to be able to translate all of the English text in your application to those languages. Have to be able to show things like loading indicators and a lot of common UI components like buttons and those types of things that seem simple, but there's a lot going on to actually make those look good, make those function well. Then there's a number of things that are specific to the application that you're developing. So in the data visualizer use case, this is visualizing data as a graph or as a chart as well. Or it could also be things like the interface in that data visualizer application to be able to manage that chart and save visualizations. So we have on the left side here, we have a whole section that's specific to this data visualizer application that lets you select which dimensions you want to display on the chart that you're talking about. You also have state management. So you need to be able to know which visualization we're currently looking at, whether that visualization has been saved or not, and other things. Then there are some things that are kind of under the hood of all these applications as well. So you have to be able to fetch data and read and write information to the DHIS2 core. You have to be able to fetch the metadata schemas, which is what we call the relational model of all of the different components in a particular DHIS2 instance. You have to be able to find the server itself, which sounds simple again, but it's not necessarily, because you might have an application that's living within DHIS2, you might have one that's living outside of it, you might have one that's living as a core application versus a third-party application, and finding where the server that application needs to talk to lives is something that every application needs to do. We need to also do things like data caching and offline support, so we're not overloading the network when an application is trying to talk to the DHIS2 core, and things like authentication and permissions to make sure that users are authenticated and are allowed to do the operations that that your application is showing them. Finally, we have some things that are specific to how we build and deploy these applications in the DHIS2 ecosystem. So that is looking at the source code of an app and finding all of the English strings that are displayed so that we can extract those and translate them to another language like French or Swahili or Spanish. We then have the concept of generation of a manifest, which is the metadata around an application. Things like, what is the name of this application? What's its description? What are some of the authorities that it requires? Things like that. Finally, there are some more development-focused things, like how do we set up tests for application? How do we test it in different browsers? How do we test it in different languages? How do we compile that application so that it works on the browsers that we want it to work in? And how do we finally publish and release our application to the world, whether that's deploying it to a specific DHIS2 instance or publishing it to the app hub, the DHIS2 app hub, so that it can be installed in any DHIS2 instance. So the basic concept here is that there's a lot going on in this, in any one application. And it gets way more complicated when we talk about all of the core applications that DHIS2 supports. So as I mentioned, there are about 34 applications that are developed by the DHIS2 core team at the University of Oslo. And each of those has all of those components I just mentioned on the previous slide, basically repeated. We share a lot of functionality in libraries, but the glue of how those are all held together is duplicated across all of these different applications, because it's they need to kind of piece those different sections together and make it work for their particular use case. And this gets even more complicated when we talk about backporting and version support. So we have 4 supported versions of DHIS2, lots of applications, lots of libraries, duplication across all of those. A lot of these are very similar, but they diverge slightly with each release, each patch release for a supported previous version of DHIS2. So you can see how this can get very complicated, very hard to manage in a consistent way. And this is where our tooling comes into play, and I'll talk a little bit about that next. So what we've built is basically a framework for building DHIS2 applications. And you can probably guess one of the reasons for this, which is that this is basically a nightmare to manage. And this is just the core applications. So this is the same situation, maybe even more difficult to maintain, applies to third-party developers that are building applications for DHIS2 and deploying them to the App Store, for instance. So why are we building a framework? The reason we're building a framework is that easy things should be easy and hard things should be possible. This is a quote from Larry Wall, who's the creator of the programming language Perl. And this is our goal with this framework, because there are so many things that every single application needs to do that seem easy, but if you have to do them 34 times or 160 times, they become less easy. So we want to make those easy things as easy as possible, but maintain the flexibility and the power of DHIS2 by continuing to support hard things that DHIS2 can do. So things that are very custom, very unique, very powerful should still be possible in this framework ecosystem. Here's a very simple example of how simple things are not necessarily simple in the DHIS2 ecosystem with all of these applications and backports and all of that. So here I've just pulled basically the tab title bar of 5 applications randomly selected from the list of applications in a DHIS2 instance. And you'll notice that these are all slightly different. So they have 3 different logos. You have 4, maybe 5, 5 different layouts or formats for how the title is actually displayed. Some say just the name of the application. Some say the name of the application and then the name of the instance. Some say the name of the application and then DHIS2. Some say nothing at all. Depends. So there are many different formats for this seemingly very simple information. And this may seem like a very small detail, and it is. It's not the most important thing of DHIS2, but that's why there is so much divergence, is because it hasn't been prioritized. And then you get into looking at all of the applications that are installed in a DHIS2 instance. Most of these are core applications, but there are a few that are third-party applications as well. And something as simple as making the logo identical in all of these should be very simple. Making the title appear the same way should be very simple. But if every developer of every application for every version of that application needs to think about something as small as making the title format exactly the same across all of their applications, it becomes basically unmaintainable and very difficult to continue to update across the board. So this is an example of a very simple, kind of not even that important detail that is getting out of sync because we have so many different applications and third-party applications that need to think about these very small things. And so you can extrapolate this to say that very simple thing is similar to a lot of the more complicated things that all these applications need to do, and we'll all need to do them slightly differently, and then they'll get out of sync and it'll be very hard to maintain. As another example of that, I'm going to show 4 different DHIS2 applications, and I want you to pay particular attention to the header bar that I mentioned earlier. So this is that same application, the Data Visualizer app, and you'll see that the header bar is one of the more modern header bars that we have. So it actually is the modern header bar here, and it has a certain look and feel. It matches the DHIS2 kind of design specifications. It has all of the it has the name of the user, the name of the application, the name of the DHIS2 instance. And here's another application. It's also a DHIS2 core application that has an older version of the header bar. This just happens to be an application that hasn't been updated in a little while. It has a different location of that title on the left side. It has the search bar actually built into the header bar rather than underneath the application list. It doesn't link to the messages or the notification or the interpretations applications. It has a different style for the profile of the user that's logged in. And here's a third one, another core application that has no header bar at all. It has a home link in kind of a custom header bar, much more legacy application. This is actually deprecated now in favor of the Data Visualizer app in the 2.34 release of DHIS2. But you'll see that this is another application that needed to be updated to maintain its consistency with the entire system. And finally, here we have a third-party application that is has a similar header bar to one of the other ones, but still slightly different location of the profile link on the top right, things like that. So this is just another example of small details that kind of multiply and make applications more and more different as we have more and more applications and more backports and more developers that are working on those applications. You'll also notice that there are some other visual things that are very different between these applications. Things like the style of the buttons, things like the way the sidebar is displayed, those types of things. So getting again into why we're building a framework. Obviously, there are some very simple things that we want to address in a holistic way across all the applications that we're working on and the ecosystem, the community is working on. But there are a number of reasons that what we call the DHIS2 application platform makes sense for implementers, users, and funders. I'll get into why this makes sense for developers as well in a minute. And there are obviously a lot of ways that it makes a developer's lives easier. But for an implementer of DHIS2, a user of DHIS2, or a funder of DHIS2, or DHIS2 instances, there are a number of advantages as well. Principal among those is more consistency across all applications, so that a user knows if they know how to use one DHIS2 application, they should be able to figure out how to use any other DHIS2 application. And that becomes very important when you're training large numbers of people to use these systems. Also, implementers get the latest features faster. So if there is a feature that's introduced in 234 that is purely an application feature, it often doesn't get backported to 233, 232, 231, because those are maintenance releases. And therefore, even though the DHIS2 core of 233 or 232 might support that feature, the implementer needs to upgrade their entire instance and their database in order to get a new feature in DHIS2 234. Similarly, but in the opposite direction, upgrading apps doesn't necessarily become required. So if we decouple applications from the backend, which I didn't mention that explicitly, but that's one of the core goals of this platform and this move to a new kind of distribution mechanism I'll talk about in a minute. It allows a DHIS2 core instance to have applications that support it, but aren't necessarily the one that was baked into that core release. This can be very helpful, again, when you're training large numbers of people to use an application, because if you want to upgrade the core and get some features, but you want to keep an older version of an application that still supports your version, that might be possible. Finally, you have simplified DHIS2 customization. It just makes it easier to build the applications that you need to customize your instance in a high quality and maintainable way. And finally, you have more high quality community applications that are being developed across the DHIS2 community and are able to be used within a DHIS2 instance. So now, why does this make sense for developers? Obviously, you can think of a number of reasons why taking things away from developers might seem limiting, but there are a lot of advantages as well. You can think of this, if you're familiar with Create React App for generic web applications, this is similar to the way we think of the platform for DHIS2. It has some limitations or some restrictions of what you can do within that platform, but those limitations are well thought out and designed to make DHIS2 applications higher quality, more robust, more user-friendly, and easier to develop. So you get a number of things out of the box with the Create React App for DHIS2, which is what we call, or how we think of our application platform. You get modern UI components, which is actually something that Create React App does not provide, but we have provided a large set and growing set of very high quality and well-designed UI components to be used in your application. You get things like up-to-date security and a robust data engine to be able to fetch data, cache data, things like that in your application without needing to worry about the inner workings of the HTTP requests and the caching headers and things that are going on behind the scenes. And finally, you get to develop apps which are, as I mentioned in the previous slide, decoupled from the DHIS2 version that you're developing against, which means that if you build an application once, you can support multiple versions of the DHIS2 core more easily than today, when you would need to, if something changed in the API, you would need to develop an entire new version of that application and add support for it. And finally, I'll get into this concept of declarativity, which is being able to declaratively tell the application platform what you want rather than how you want to do it. So I'll get into a little bit more about that in a minute, but that's another advantage for developers here. So now I'm going to give, and this is going to be a lot of information. Again, we'll get into more of this later. There's more information online. We'll also have a more technical introduction to some of these specific tools next week on another webinar. But this will be a high-level overview of what the DHIS2 application platform does. The first principle of the DHIS2 application platform is inversion of control. So what does that mean? That means that we have this list of all these components that are within a DHIS2 application. And historically, to build a DHIS2 app, you have to build a top-level thing that includes all of these individual pieces. With inversion of control, we kind of flip that on its head. You might have noticed that the way I laid this out and the way it's, the different components here, there are only three things, the middle layer here, that are unique to this particular application. Everything else, to some level or another, is necessary in every single DHIS2 application. So this is the actual app, and the rest of it is just things that a developer needs to worry about to make it high quality, robust, consistent, and modern in the DHIS2 world. The rest of that we're calling an app shell. And that basically is what this inversion of control is. So the app shell is the wrapper of the application, and the application can focus on just what it cares about, what makes it special and what makes it tick. So in this way, what the application platform does is it redefines what an application is in the DHIS2 ecosystem. So rather than a DHIS2 app being a standalone web application that just happens to talk to the DHIS2 web API, which is still possible today. So it's still possible to build a completely custom web application that talks to the DHIS2 API and deploy it as an app on the DHIS2 App Hub or in a DHIS2 instance. But to take advantage of a lot of these simplifications that we've provided in the application platform, a DHIS2 app doesn't need to equal that standalone web application. So the web application becomes the shell that wraps your application and provides all of these kind of out-of-the-box functionality. So the reason we can do this is that we can control the development ecosystem, which is the build process and the libraries that are used. And we can also control the delivery mechanism, which is delivering from the application developer to the App Hub. I put App Store here. It's been changed. The name has been changed to App Hub. I apologize. Which is can then be used to install that application into the DHIS2 core instance installed somewhere in the world. Finally, we have the data access layer, which we can control, which is the interface between a DHIS2 web application and the DHIS2 core. And we can make a lot of simplifying assumptions as well as consistency of approach in how we apply that to DHIS2 web apps. So this allows us to change our picture from before, where we had 34 different copies of this complex DHIS2 application, to something that's a little bit more sane, where we can duplicate the outer part is only in one place. It's not duplicated everywhere. And we can slot in the custom secret sauce or the special component that makes this application work and makes it do what it does best. So this is for the core applications. It becomes much simpler to maintain, to develop these individual applications. And the same is true for third-party applications or applications that are developed by developers not at the University of Oslo, DHIS2 core. One of the key advantages here is that the tools that we're building we're using internally, and we're also exposing those same tools to third-party applications. So we're eating our own dog food, as they say, in using these tools to build our own applications, make them higher quality, make them more consistent, and provide those same tools to anyone else that wants to make a DHIS2 app. The second piece, so that's inversion of control, which is taking the core functionality of an application, pulling that out and making everything else common and used in the same way across all different applications. The second piece of this application platform is unified build tooling. So rather than needing to pull together a bunch of different build tools to build your application, we have a single wrapper around that tool that builds it, injects it into the application platform or application shell, and builds an application for deployment to the App Hub. This is a simplified version of what you can see there. You have your app source, your dependencies, and your translation strings. You call the build script, and you end up with the bundled application, which is injected into the app shell that has all those other things like the header bar, like server discovery, like data caching, all already built in and ready to go. This is just a simple example of what a set of dependencies for a core application looked like before the migration to DHIS2 application platform. You can see that there's a lot of dependencies here. It's not necessary to know what all of these do or what the what this application is specifically doing, but you can see that there's a lot going on. It's very complex. If you have to upgrade any one of these dependencies, it takes a lot of time and a lot of manual testing to make that happen. This is what it looks like, simplified again, after the migration to App Shell. So rather than having hundreds of dependencies, or not hundreds, but tens of dependencies, we have one development dependency and basically one runtime dependency, which is the app runtime. So the CLI app scripts that we have here is, what, as I mentioned, the unified build tool to do a lot of things that we mentioned are necessary to build a DHIS2 application. There's a list of them there. You have to extract the translation strings from your code base. You have to generate a manifest, generate test infrastructure, transpile for particular browsers, encapsulate the application in the app shell so that it has all of those common components already built in, target different browsers, things like that. And coming soon, we'll be able to simply say D2 app scripts publish or D2 app scripts deploy to push that application directly to a DHIS2 instance or to the DHIS2 App Store from the command line without needing to go through multiple steps of being able to do that. We're also working on enabling embeddable plugin builds through this application platform as well. Currently, those are built outside of the platform, but bringing those in so that an application can also expose a plugin version of itself that can be embedded in the dashboard or in a third-party application. This is just kind of a little bit more of the metadata that's involved in building with the application platform. So we have a config file that gives the kind of metadata of that application, things like the description, the title, where the source code lives. Fairly simple, straightforward, but this is a single place where the configuration lives, and this is used to generate the manifest and the application bundle itself. I'm going to get into this in a minute, actually. So I'm going to talk about this in another section. So yeah, this is this section. So the third component of the application platform that we have is a common runtime. So this allows us to simplify the tooling for doing things at runtime when an application is actually running. We call it app-runtime. It's here. It has a number of different components within it. We have a UI primitives, which I'll get into in a minute later. We have API data fetching, which is, again, I'll get into in a minute, but that basically allows us to have a consistent way to fetch data from the DHIS2 API, as well as to write data to the DHIS2 API, and to cache it and to do all sorts of transformations on that data. That's also done in a declarative way, which I'll get into in a minute. This also does things like translation, configuration, server discovery, and authentication. And soon it will do more data caching, offline support, and loading and error handling as well. The component that I mentioned there, UI primitives, is one of the major libraries that we've developed as part of this system. We call that the UI library. So DHIS2/UI is on NPM. I'll get into that a little bit more technically next week with some of my colleagues. But what is the design system and the UI primitives that we have? So the design system is, I'll go ahead and open this link here. It's a very thorough exploration of what it means to be a DHIS2 application and to follow the principles of design that make an application accessible and usable and user-friendly and consistent across all the different applications. So my colleague Joe has put this together. It's fantastic, but it has a lot of rules about how you communicate in an application, how you build a model of what your application is, how you do things like error messages, how you talk to the user in the text that you're putting in your application, all of those types of things, which may seem overwhelming, but there's a lot of kind of concrete specific advice in here as well for individual components. So for things like a button, what does a button look like in our design system? What are the different forms that button might take, and how does it work in different contexts? So there's a lot of specific advice in here for different pieces of input, different components that might be included to build up your application. And we actually have here a full library of components, of React components that follow this design guideline and make it very, very easy to integrate those applications into your, those components into your application. So I'll share that very quickly as well. Go ahead and go to the live demos. But you can see that, let's take a moment to load. You can see that these are all components that you can include. So this is an alert bar that just shows up here at the bottom that's very easy to include in your application. We also have, as we mentioned just below, things like buttons that can be disabled, that can be large, small, focused, etc. This is very similar to what DHIS2 applications have used in the past, which is Material UI, but it's specific to DHIS2 and follows the design guidelines that we have so that everything across DHIS2 is consistent and has this consistent look and feel as well as accessibility to users, typical DHIS2 users. I won't go into all of these components. Again, we'll go into more detail about this next week on the other webinar. So this is the fourth component of the application platform. Again, I mentioned this is the different types of buttons that you can include, and there's a lot of different components there. The fifth component, the last one here, is declarativity, which is a principle of the application platform, and specifically for fetching data from the DHIS2 core instance. And so I'm going to go talk very briefly about what is declarative data fetching and what is declarativity. As an example here, when you give someone a destination, but you don't tell them how to get there, you're giving them something declarative. A destination is declarative. If I say that this is the address of a boulangerie in Paris, it doesn't tell you where you are, what the steps you need to take to actually get there. It just tells you what your destination is. That's something that's declarative. Whereas something that's imperative is like turn-by-turn directions. So if I say, head west on this street, turn left after the 2 blocks, then take your third right, and then you'll see the destination on your left. That tells me exactly, if I'm standing here, where do I get to, or how do I get to the place that I want to go? So the principle of the application platform is that we embrace declarativity in our the way we fetch data, the way we fetch information, and the way we pass state through our applications. The way this works for fetching data from the DHIS2 core is that the application will tell the application shell its destination, not a set of steps for how to get to that destination, but just what type of data it wants, and the application shell will figure out how to get it. It might get that information from a local cache. It might get that information from the DHIS2 server. It might do a combination of both. But the application shouldn't care where that data is coming from or how it's being fetched or what network requests are going across the network. It should just care what data it wants, and the application shell should take care of the rest. So that's one of the principles of the application runtime and the data fetching engine that we've developed there. I'm going to sort of skim over the code here. Again, we're going to get into more detail about this next week, but this is before the application runtime and the declarative data fetching. This is how data fetching worked for fetching, for instance, indicators in DHIS2. And this is actually probably simpler than a lot of actual production use cases of this data fetching, because it makes a lot of assumptions. It also uses hooks, which make the code a lot shorter than other types of React components or Angular or other types of frameworks. But there's quite a bit of code here and a lot of complexity in determining whether the request fails, or while figuring out how it's loading, or figuring out what the location of the server is and what version of the API to fetch from. That shouldn't necessarily be built into this component or this particular request. And so the way we kind of abstract that all away with our application runtime by using what we call a data query. So you declare a query, which tells what instance or what type of data you want to fetch. In this case, we're fetching indicators, and we're fetching a specific indicator with an ID. And then we just have one line here that says use data query, which is a hook from our app runtime library that lets you fetch that data or request that data. And then the runtime itself will make the request across the network if necessary. If it has caching enabled, it will look it up in the cache. It'll just return to you whether you're loading, whether you've returned an error, or whether you have got the data back from the server. So this is a much simpler way of doing exactly the same thing that we had previously. Oops. Oops. Yeah. There we go. Much simpler than what we had previously. So I'm going to talk next about the application lifecycle. And this is a pretty simple diagram, but it shows basically how we develop, deploy, and install applications in DHIS2 with this newer system. So the first on the left here, I'm not going to get into this too much today, but another tool that we've developed is the Docker D2 cluster command, which I'll show a very quick introduction to the command line tool. Basically, we have a command line tool for DHIS2, and one of the commands within that CLI tool is the ability to spin up local instances of DHIS2 for different versions of DHIS2 to test for your backend. So this will very easily be able to say, just with a single command like this, spins up a local containerized version of DHIS2 with its own database to be able to test your application against. This is to test against 232, but it might also be 233 or 234, and you can also test against development versions of your application as well. Again, I'm not going to get into that in too much detail. There's a fair amount of documentation out there to get you started. So that's when you're actually developing an application locally. You then use the tool, the application platform, to bundle that application and put it into the application shell, and to publish that application then to the DHIS2 App Hub, where it can be installed into a DHIS2 production instance. We'll get into a little bit more about the App Hub, apps.dhis2.org next week as well. So where do we go from here? I've had kind of a whirlwind introduction to all these different components of the application platform. And these are sort of our priorities for the next 6 months for developing that system further. Number one is going to be continuous application delivery. This is in the 235 timeframe, so in the next 6 months. Continuous application delivery, which means that our core applications will start to leverage the application hub to decouple from the backend, the core DHIS2 instance, and be able to deploy and release versions of the application to the App Hub that can then be installed into supported versions of the backend. So if you have 233 and there's a new version of the data visualizer application that just came out, you can install that into your 233 application rather than, or instance, rather than needing to upgrade to 235 to get that latest version. That's not going to come to all applications at the same time, but we're hoping to get the main functionality into 235 to be able to leverage that and leverage these tools across our workflows. Second is going to be decoupling the web apps from DHIS2 core, which is, as I mentioned, specifically for core applications, making the releases independent of the core releases. We then have, and this is part of that as well, but feature toggling, which enables a single application, including a third-party application, to talk to multiple versions of the DHIS2 core, 235, 234, 233, 232, et cetera. And be able to turn on and off different functionality inside that application, depending on which backend version you're talking to. And then the second set of priorities for the 235 release are consistency in our internationalization, reducing of bundle sizes and static asset caching, and data caching and offline support for our application, which is going to be really big addition to the application platform to enable caching and offline support natively without any changes to the applications themselves. Feature toggling, again, I talked about this just a moment ago, but basically allows you to build an application that talks to multiple versions of the application or of the DHIS2 core. So I've kind of given, this has been a very whirlwind overview of a lot of different pieces of this application platform and application workflow. So now I'm gonna slow down a little bit and point everyone to some resources for where you can learn more about these things, where you can explore them, and where you can join the community and ask questions about these new tools, where they're going, what we have to do to make them happen. First off, we have some upcoming events that we're pretty excited about. So we have had this very high-level introduction webinar today. We'll dive a little bit more technically into a few of those individual tools, things like the UI core, the application platform itself, the application runtime, the design system, next week on another webinar with several presenters. And then at the end of June, we'll be hosting a workshop, which is basically a replacement for an in-person academy, which during the times of COVID-19 are not really possible. It'll be an online workshop to have hands-on interaction with the DHIS2 core team to see how you can develop applications and build customizations of DHIS2. That'll be towards the end of June, and we'll have some links coming up for that as well. And then finally, again, the developers.dhis2.org is the place to go for like a centralized location for all of our announcements, events, documentation, getting started guides, and the community of practice. We have a dedicated section in the community of practice for the application developer community. And we encourage everyone to join that, ask your questions there, talk to the DHIS2 core team there. And that's really where we hope to see everyone and get to know you guys a little bit better. So I'm going to turn this over to questions, see if anything has come up on the community of practice, or if anybody wants to post anything now in the chat or in the community of practice. I'll go ahead and answer some of those questions. Also want to just hear from people as we go forward what you'd like to see in our efforts to facilitate DHIS2 application development. What you see as missing, what you see as could be improved, because we're very much looking for feedback in that regard. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to questions. Let's see if anybody has posted on that here, or if yeah, let's see. So Peter had a good question here about in the design system, there are no code examples. For example, other UI libraries, there are code pens, etc. This is definitely something we plan to add. So one of the main efforts that we're working on in the developers.dhis2.org area area is to show, to extend our documentation. So we have a list of documentation here. The design system that I showed earlier is the high-level kind of overview of the individual, or of the rules of design in DHIS2 applications. Whereas things like this UI core is a React library that we can show. Let's see if I have this correct. There should be documentation in here. So you can actually see, I'll show it here. There, I think we need to turn the JSX extension back on here, but we do have a, in the source code for that demonstration, we do have the ability to actually see these, the source code that's creating these individual stories. So if we go to, for instance, wait, I am losing my train of thought here. Here we go. So if we look at the button stories, for instance, you can see the code example for exactly how to make a button with on-click, or button with disabled, or button with small. And we do want to make that much more accessible and build out that documentation, consolidate that documentation. So that's definitely on the roadmap in the next few months as we work towards the development practices. See what other questions we have. So this is another good question. I didn't get into it too much here, but there's the DHIS2 is not just a front-end application. So there is a DHIS2 core with an API. The extension of DHIS2 in a formal capacity is currently restricted to front-end applications. However, that doesn't mean that you can't build server extensions, and many people do build server-side sidecar services that interact with the DHIS2 API, interact with DHIS2 applications, and are able to do, like, have their own database or interact with the DHIS2 database, those types of things. Very much is possible in the DHIS2 ecosystem. The difference is that a front-end application is something that can be installed from the DHIS2 interface in a particular instance. You can go to the App Hub or upload a zip file and install a new application, which is something you can't do with a server-side tool. That's something that we're looking at extending in the future, but it's not currently the behavior that we have. So will there be options to ignore caching when fetching data? Yes, that is definitely something. That's one of the reasons that we don't have exhaustive caching at the moment. And you can see in some of our notes about the roadmap of these tools that in the caching use case, I'm going to go ahead and show this here, data engine caching. So this is very much a work in progress, but we have kind of 3 levels of caching that we hope to implement. The first is just deduplication of requests that happen at the same time. So if you have multiple components that are requesting the same data, maybe in slightly different ways because they're requesting slightly different fields, we should deduplicate those requests so you're not requesting the same data twice over the network. So that's the first, that's not even really caching, that's deduplication. The second level of caching is single session application caching, which is within a single session of your application, you have the same request multiple times from different components. Unless you specifically request that you want to ignore the cache, which will be an option in the runtime, we want to deduplicate that and load it from the cache instead. But there will, as your question said, there will be an option to ignore that cache or to skip that cache and make sure that you're loading the most recent information for cases where you need that. And then the final piece would be offline caching, which is when an application is able to actually go fully offline and not have any internet connection at all. and being able to load information directly from the cache, being able to indicate to the user of an application that they are offline and they're viewing potentially stale cache data, for instance. And we have some support for that in a few applications, but we're looking at extending that, as I mentioned, in the 235, 236 timeframe to be basically a built-in feature of the application platform. Let's see if we had. Oops. Where did my? It looks like I lost my questions. I'm going to go ahead and get these back. Looking at this again, we have. So yes, so as Baktash asked here, the app shell the app shell has many different dependencies within it, which are implemented as libraries. So the app runtime is one of those. The UI library is another of those, and those all can be used independently of the app shell itself. We recommend that people use the platform, and if there are deficiencies in the platform that prevent you from using it in your application, please bring those up to us so that we can work on them and work together to make sure that we're supporting all the use cases for DHIS2 apps. But if you need just a single, you're working on a legacy application or something and you want to use just the app runtime or the UI library or the translation library or those types of things, those are all available as independent libraries that you can include as well. Hopefully that answers that question. It looks like that's about our time for today. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining and recommend that if you're interested in this, and particularly if you're interested in the technical side of things, that you join us next week for the technical introduction to each of these tools, how to use the UI library. So you'll get some of the code examples that Peter was asking for as well there. And so go ahead and join us for the technical introduction webinar. There is a registration link on developers.dhis2.org. You can find that just here.
Austin?
Yes.
In the chat box, I just put the registration link for next week webinar as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so Alice just posted the registration link in the chat box. It's also on DHIS2 developers.dhis2.org. You'll see this registration link here for the platform tools webinar next week, June 10th, Wednesday, at the same time as this webinar. And then we'll be probably just after this, I'll be updating this to have a link to the workshop as well. I forgot to mention that we'll also be having a second workshop probably in August. And we'll be offering effectively the equivalent of Academy certification for participants that participate in both Workshop 1 and Workshop 2, the equivalent of doing an in-person DHIS2 Level 2 Academy for those. So more details about that will be coming soon, and yeah, stay tuned for that. Feel free to reach out to myself or to the team, and particularly on the community of practice. If you go to the development section and select the app development subsection, this is where we'll be fielding lots of questions. So feel free to reach out to the core team and to your fellow developers on there. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. And yeah, I'll stay on for a couple more minutes if anybody has any more questions from in the chat or in the community of practice. But thank you again, and hopefully see you all next week. There was one question, it looks like, in the chat there, that will there be a recording shared? Yes, there will. This has all been recorded, so I will be sharing that on developers.dhis2.org and on the community of practice as well.
Oh,
Thank you, everyone. I just saw a question come in from Kenneth that is there or will there be a group or committee that could help review, suggest, or approve third-party apps before release to the App Hub? Currently, that is the DHIS2 core team, and we're working on extending and formalizing our review process. But that is a great suggestion. I think that something we should definitely look into is having a committee that is able to review and suggest those applications on the App Hub. Right now, there's a dozen or so on there, but we're hoping to really expand that and build out the quality and the quantity of high quality applications on the App Hub. And so I think that would be very, very helpful. And we're looking at also ways to enable some sustainability for those applications so that you can install an app from the App Hub and have some indication of the whether that's still maintained, who's maintaining it, and how to directly contact them or to contribute to the development of those applications as well. A few options there. Jay asked, is there any upcoming webinars for backend development and contributing to the core? Not that I know of at the moment, but I will take that as a suggestion and bring that up with the rest of the team. I think that could be something that's could be very interesting. I don't know if any of the backend team is on the call here, but I'll definitely share with them as well. That's something that I think could be very useful, both contributing to the core as well as showing some examples and best practices for how to develop backend services. So integrations with the API that run on a server rather than in a front-end web application. Okay, just checking one last time. And it looks like that is all the questions for now. Feel free to continue to post on the community practice, but I'll go ahead and end this webinar in just a minute. Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and look forward to talking to you soon. Hopefully see you all next week on the webinar on June 10th. Thank you very much.